Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know there's some concerns that I may take a while. I want to reassure everyone that I am going to be brief, as brief as possible anyway, because I know that most members do want to speak on this important motion, and I don't want to take up all the time, so I will get on with my contribution. Mr. Speaker, I think we're all familiar with the saying, "Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater," and what that means. And in rising to give my contribution to this government motion on the Cayman Islands Constitution Amendment Order 2019, I spent some time reflecting on what I would say today, bearing in mind that there have been some controversial moments, and it hasn't been smooth sailing the whole way, but just about a year ago, tomorrow, I think, I was in the UK as part of the government negotiating team, negotiating these changes along with the former leader of the opposition, the member from Northside. And, one year later, a lot has changed politically, not just here in the Cayman Islands, Mr. Speaker, but globally. But we are now finally at a point when we can discuss and debate these proposed changes. In not trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater, Mr. Speaker, which is where I'm going to focus most of my debate, is on why these proposed changes are actually good for this country. And in our haste to be political, sometimes we may overlook the good we're trying to achieve, and the adverse effect of that, Mr. Speaker, would be to throw out something good because we're not doing things for the right reasons. So I really did have to think long and hard about what I would say, Mr. Speaker. Naturally, there are people on either side, all sides of this issue. And I've learned in my short time in politics that you can't please everyone, but you can respect everybody's points of view. And that is a fact of politics. What I have come to understand, some of the viewpoints are, Mr. Speaker, with regard to this motion, is that some people feel that we could make the necessary changes to the Constitution to protect us from another incidence of overreach by the United Kingdom government, which is the path that we've taken today by debating on this motion and then hopefully voting on it. Some people hold the viewpoint that we should first hold a referendum on the changes and allow the people to voice their opinion and their views via their vote. Or, Mr. Speaker, we could wait for the 2021 elections, and if those who are elected campaign on constitutional change, then whoever the majority is at the time, if they are elected, then they could go ahead and put the changes in place or go back to the negotiating table. Or, Mr. Speaker, we could simply do nothing. So while I respect all those viewpoints, Mr. Speaker, and I've heard different variations of those viewpoints come forward from people in the public and people who are interested in this debate. My point of view and my position is that I understand clearly what needs to be done here today. And I believe that at the crux of that, Mr. Speaker, it is that without hesitation, We must move to protect the Cayman Islands, and we must not waver in our commitment to do so. Mr. Speaker, this is no time for us to play hero, to play politics, to play the victim, or play the fool. We have a serious task presented in front of us here today. And if we are truly looking for an us versus them, this could be it, but it's not government versus opposition today. It is us working together. If you want an us versus them, it is Cayman versus those in the UK Parliament who chose to overreach and went outside the remit of their roles in their parliament. So today, Mr. Speaker, we have a huge opportunity to enhance the autonomy of this country and to protect it from what I just call an overreach, the imposition of laws enacted not here in our honorable house, Mr. Speaker, but almost 5,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that I started down the path of studying law not so long ago. I was trying to not make it become a public knowledge, but it has become public knowledge, so you own up to the things that you're doing. And I did it for a very distinct reason, Mr. Speaker. I did it because I felt that studying law would enhance my ability to serve the people of Newlands and the people of this country generally. So yes, I've gone down that pathway, and it has helped, Mr. Speaker. Matter of fact, I have this experience starting almost a year ago has inspired me to write about the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering 2018 bill as my dissertation for law school. So I've been doing some research, and I've been doing compiling some thoughts on what exactly happened, which was, Mr. Speaker, in 2018, when the UK House of Commons passed an amendment to the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018, and in their amendment guidance notes was written that this new clause requires the Secretary of State to provide all reasonable assistance to the governments of British overseas territories to enable them to establish publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownership of companies, and to do so no later than 31st of December 2020, to prepare a draft order in Council requiring the government of any such territory that had not introduced such a register to do so. Mr. Speaker, we all know that that amendment was passed in both houses of Parliament and imposed an obligation on the British overseas territories to implement those registers of beneficial ownership no later than December 31st, 2020. And it gave the UK government the authority to forcibly implement the registers through an order in Council, should any of the existing overseas territories fail to do so on their own. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, this caused quite a bit of concern throughout the overseas territories. Mr. Speaker, to date, the use of orders in Council had been reserved for use in matters that the UK felt it had an international obligation to implement across the legislatures of the overseas territories, such as abolishing the death penalty and decriminalizing homosexuality, for example. Mr. Speaker, The UK, through their parliament, had also approved individual constitutions for the overseas territories. And these individual constitutions were based on the principles of rule of law, parliamentary supremacy. And from the perspective of the rule of law, Mr. Speaker, and in applying some of the rules, the constitutions of the overseas territories have to ensure that the laws of those territories are accessible, applied without discretion, applied equally, limited to their intended purpose, protective of rights, not cost prohibitive, and unnecessarily lengthy to resolve disputes, fair and binding on the state in national and international affairs. Those constitutions, Mr. Speaker, also established the supremacy of the UK Parliament and operate on the basis that they were established by an act in the UK Parliament, and therefore are constrained and operate under those powers directly conferred on them. Mr. Speaker, the extent that prerogative powers still exist and the extent that they can and will be applied in the context of the constitutional arrangements is also an area of controversy and must be examined from the perspective of the amendment that was passed. Mr. Speaker, many believe that the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018 amendment was a political move based on global reaction to the Panama Paradise Papers and failed to take into account the existence of the lack of a global standard for beneficial public registers and the failings of the UK's own register and the lack of inclusion of the Crown dependencies, failure to recognize the different levels of compliance with international requirements such as the FATF anti-money laundering regime, and failure to assess the overseas territories' capabilities and standards. All of these, Mr. Speaker, point to the hypocrisy of what was done to these islands by what I consider a rogue member of the UK Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, I need for the record to also mention several recent incidents which will hopefully illustrate how urgent and important it is that we move forward with what it is that we're doing here today. And I want to refer back to the 23rd of June 2016 when the UK actually voted to leave the EU. The Leave campaign, Mr. Speaker, everybody knows, won by 51.9%. And in the aftermath of that, Prime Minister David Cameron announced his resignation. Then on the 13th of July 2016, Theresa May became Prime Minister. And as the Times said, no new Prime Minister in the modern era will have entered Downing Street with an in-tray as full and faithful as hers. Mr. Speaker, on the 17th of January, Brexit, in her first substantial speech on Brexit, Theresa May said that remaining in the single market would mean being bound by EU laws, which to all intents and purposes would mean not leaving the EU at all. That speech revealed her desire to move forward with a hard Brexit. On the 29th of March 2017, Mr. Speaker, May triggered Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, formally kickstarting the 2-year countdown to the exit. On the 8th of June 2017, Theresa May lost her parliamentary majority and was forced to make a deal with the DUP to stay in power. On the 8th of December 2017, following a series of late-night negotiations in Brussels, the UK and the EU agreed a deal on the UK's so-called divorce bill. On the 6th of July 2018, Theresa May took her cabinet to her country retreat in order to sign off on a collective position for the rest of the Brexit negotiations. Mr. Speaker, at that meeting, David Davis resigned over May's new plan, and Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson followed Davis out the door. Mr. Speaker, on the 25th of November 2018, a 599-page draft withdrawal agreement was published. That agreement actually angered both the DUP and the Tories Brexiteers. Speaker, on the 15th of January and 12th of March 2019, May attempted to get her deal ratified by the Parliament, but with Brexiteers worried about the UK remaining in the customs union through the backstop, and the DUP concerned about potential disparity between Northern Ireland, the UK, the Prime Minister suffered the heaviest defeat in modern parliamentary history, losing 432 votes to 202. On the 12th of April, the UK's deadline for leaving the UK was pushed back to the 31st of October. Speaker, on the 24th of June, after failing 3 times to get her withdrawal agreement through Parliament, Theresa May set a resignation date for 7th of June. The 24th of July, Boris Johnson took over as Prime Minister. On the 28th of August, the new Prime Minister asked the Queen to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks. On the 4th of September, MPs took back control and Boris Johnson demanded a general election. Mr. Speaker, on the 2nd of October, Johnson set out his reasonable compromise Brexit deal. The 6th of October, following a phone call between Johnson and Angela Merkel, it was an announcement that the Brexit deal was overwhelmingly unlikely. On the 19th of October, Johnson was legally obliged by the Benn Act to send a letter to the EU on that date requesting a 3-month Brexit extension after Parliament refused to pass his deal. And now, Mr. Speaker, we've arrived at the point where on the 12th of December 2019, there will be a general election in the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, I took the time to go through that detail because I wanted to make the point that I don't want anyone to miss with regard to this bill, this motion. If we were ever in a position that we had to do something urgently and we had to act quickly, decisively, it is now. That timeline that I just read, Mr. Speaker, highlights how volatile and uncertain the political climate is. And I sincerely doubt that this legislature is going to get another opportunity like this anytime soon. This shows how uncertain politics can be. And at times like this, Mr. Speaker, I have my manifesto here. I'm not going to read it or table it, but I brought it along just to remind me. I didn't campaign on this. I don't have any form of mandate to do this. I don't think many of us would, because I don't think this was on anybody's mind in the 2017 elections. But the challenges of the day and the situation that's presented itself to us, all of us, we have to act. So there are times that you don't have a political mandate, and it is justified that you move forward and do what you think is best. I will read, Mr. Speaker, though, from a quote that I have on the cover of my manifesto. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. I think we all know who wrote that, Martin Luther King, Jr. And I chose that to put on the cover of my manifesto for a reason, and it was to remind me that there would be days like today. That despite having to put aside some of the things that you would have ordinarily pushed for, you have to strive to do what is best. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact that not many of us would have had this in our manifestos could be used as an argument to say that we should wait and do this all by referendum. But I read the letter from Mr. Chris Bryant to your good self, Mr. Speaker, and while these changes are not minor, I think that we have arrived at a point where the controversy has now been dealt with. We heard the leader of the opposition say that most of his concerns have been addressed. And I think that I can safely say that we have all spent the time necessary to go through these changes, these proposed changes. So, Speaker, changing the name of the Legislative Assembly to the Parliament is, as the Premier said earlier, not just a name change, but it raises the stature of this honorable House. And in the Westminster system, commonly used word is Parliament. Legislature is more generic description. The changes to Section 32, and I won't go through these in painstaking detail, Mr. Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition already has, but I think that they are significant enough that we need to make sure people understand why we're supporting these changes. The amendment to Section 32, again, is going to require the Governor to consult with Cabinet, even in the exercise of his or her special responsibilities in Section 55. And it removes the inability to inquire into the Governor's actions in court. That is significant. And it increases the requirement for the government to inform Cabinet on civil service matters. Speaker, the amendment to Section 44, as the Honorable Leader of the Opposition said, has been basically parked until after the next general election. New Section 54 creates parliamentary secretaries, which effectively, I think the intention is to just replace councillors with parliamentary secretaries. While I understand some of the concerns that the Honorable Leader of the Opposition pointed out, I did serve as a councillor, and I understand how important those roles are to any government in managing their workload, their ministerial load, and being able to delegate to a trusted colleague to get on with doing some work. So I understand the value that those parliamentary secretaries will bring to the government. The amendment to Section 58, Mr. Speaker, also removes the ability of the Governor to ignore the advice of the National Security Council without the intervention of the Secretary of State, which again, is a positive change, more accountability. New Section 58, Leader of the Opposition talked about the creation of the Police Service Commission. and involves the appointment of local people, which is something that we've all heard our constituents talk about. We've all heard politicians talk about. That we want more involvement and more control over what the police service does. This, as the leader of the opposition described it, is a baby step. And in case, Mr. Speaker, anyone is concerned, the drafters have gone to the length of ensuring that none of these individuals would be serving politicians, which again provides a layer of protection against any potential for corruption, which is something else that people have talked about for many years. Speaker, the amendment to Section 71 removes the governor's ability to influence the standing orders in this legislature. The amendment to Section 77, the leader of the opposition talked about the consultation period and the lengthening of that, which can only be good. And the removal of Section 80, which is, for lack of a better word, is huge. The governor takes away the governor's ability to disallow laws passed by this legislature. Sorry, the Secretary of State. This enhances the autonomy, Mr. Speaker, of this legislature and of our elected representatives. The amendment to Section 81, Mr. Speaker, again, protects us against legislation being passed outside of the parliamentary process. And again, is very important to preserving the integrity of our democracy. To ensure that the laws we pass, things we do, reflect the wishes of the people we represent. So if for example, governor wants legislation passed, which relates to his Section 55 responsibilities, he or she must address this parliament. I know that is not normal convention, Mr. Speaker, but it is a fair trade-off, I think, to remove that ability to just pass legislation without the involvement of this legislature. The amendment to Section 124 just really inserts references to the Police Commission and inserts the use of the word Parliament. The new Section 126 requires that the Secretary of State receive input from the Premier on behalf of the Parliament on any proposed act that the UK Parliament wishes to apply directly to these islands, or any order in council being extended to these islands. It may not exactly prevent that happening, Mr. Speaker, but it does open up the dialogue and gives us an opportunity, through the Premier, to actually be involved in the process. Overall, Mr. Speaker, these changes represent, I think, advancements to the Constitution, which are designed to protect these islands from another overreach by the UK Parliament, the UK legislating on our behalf, and or making decisions for us with regard to domestic matters. I think that these changes also serve to advance our Constitution, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the Governor and Secretary of State cannot and will not simply just act on their own with regard to passing laws which will impact the governance of this country. Mr. Speaker, I personally didn't see I was neither here nor there with regard to the additional minister. But after having talked to the now leader of the opposition, I take his point and his concerns to the balance of the effect that will have on the balance of power within here. And I agree that one needs to be parked and talked about some more so that we get that right. But it is good to see that this honorable House will be solely responsible for the advancement of the standing orders and for the laws being passed domestically in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, we always talk about, and I know that what I've gone through here will draw some criticism, Mr. Speaker, because I've already heard some people make reference to the fact that we are changing the Constitution to make ourselves more powerful and give ourselves more power and the ability to have less oversight from the United Kingdom. But Mr. Speaker, I think that point of view is contrary to what we also hear a lot of our people complain about, is that Caymanians don't get opportunities, and that we are capable, but we don't get the opportunities to show that and to be masters of our domain and captain of the ship. But Mr. Speaker, these are baby steps towards us being able to do that. We are leaders in this region, both from a financial services point of view and tourism. There's no doubting that. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that it would be our desire to advance our Constitution to the point where we have more autonomy and more internal control over what happens to this country politically moving forward. We always talk about, Mr. Speaker, people underestimating our ability. So while the 19 honorable members in this legislature will have some more power in their hands and more autonomy in how the country is run, we shouldn't see this as a bad thing. We should see this as an advancement and a positive move. Caymanians are ready to take more responsibility. And we all swore an oath, Mr. Speaker, that we would do what we could to make the lives of our people better. That's our primary responsibility. I don't think anyone got elected and came in here with the intention to make things worse. While we may disagree on how we go about doing that, we all came here from that same basic understanding that we chose to serve to make people's lives better. So I see this, Mr. Speaker, as a positive move, and it takes us even further away from that colonial system that used to govern these islands. But why, Mr. Speaker? I know we will get the complaints, we will be accused of all sorts of wrongdoing. I'm a realist, and I know what to expect, Mr. Speaker. And the criticism will come. Why are we doing this without a referendum? Mr. Speaker, the Partnership for Progress and Prosperity, when presented by the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Robin Cook, defined the new relationship between the UK and the overseas territories. He presented a renewed contract between the UK and the territories, which was focused on citizenship, environmental goals, financial standards, good governance, and human rights. That partnership, Mr. Speaker, sought to ensure that the political development in the territories was given high priority, that a consultative approach and mutual understanding was given, effect to via the establishment of the Overseas Territories Consultative Council. Sounds good, but just how much of that has been achieved? Mr. Speaker, our progress towards this day hasn't been perfect. And while I was a member of the negotiating team, and I will say that it was quite encouraging that relatively younger members of this Honorable House were chosen. Myself, the Minister from West Bay South, the Minister from Georgetown North, relatively inexperienced legislators were chosen to assist the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition. It was encouraging that we were given that opportunity. And I think our presence there allowed a very broad cross-section of the viewpoints of the people of this country to be represented. I will not start to complain about what happened after we came back. I wanted to say that when we came, there was a lot going on, and I haven't really received any updates. I didn't know that we actually had received a draft order from as early as January. But then again, there are other issues, I think, Mr. Speaker, that make some of our people more skeptical and critical of what we're doing. And if we had gone down the road of ensuring that the standards in public life had been enacted, that the district council law had been dealt with, and even the referendum law, I think that the course for us would be a lot easier here today, because those failings will attract criticism, and people will say, well, if you couldn't do that, why are you doing this? It will come. But I can't stand here, Mr. Speaker, and let this debate devolve into us versus them across the aisle. For whatever reason, certain things didn't happen. But here we are today. And I think today of all days, we have to rise above the politics. And we have to get this done in the best interest of this country. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if we will ever be presented with an opportunity like this again, given the volatility of politics in the United Kingdom and globally. We don't know what is going to happen when the UK goes to the polls in a few days. But Mr. Speaker, I really had to do some soul searching, because having been involved in the most recent people-initiated referendum for the port, having been involved in the one-person, one-vote referendum, and advocating for referendum both times, I feel a bit torn. And I don't want anyone to make the mistake of thinking that I've now changed my view on the necessity for referendum, either government or people. Either way, I understand now why those provisions are in our Constitution, and why most constitutions, modern constitutions across the world, would contain provisions that allow for either people-initiated referendum or government-initiated. But I do want to assure those listening and those concerned that in what our Constitution requires is that when their issues are no longer considered controversial, then we can take this path. And I always understood, Mr. Speaker, that this would be the chosen method to implement these changes, because after having gone to the UK, negotiated, my understanding is that we told them what we wanted, they told us what we could get, it was back and forth. We would come back with a list of agreed changes, and then those would be presented here, and we would debate them. And while there are those who may say, Mr. Speaker, that that doesn't allow the public to weigh in and the public to have a say, it actually does, because we are elected by the public. We are elected and represent the voters of this country. There are 19 of us, Mr. Speaker. And so through us, our constituents will have their say. And while the timeline hasn't allowed for, especially given everything else that was happening at the time, but the timeline hasn't really allowed for wide-scale public consultation, hasn't allowed for us to go throughout the country and have public meetings, to conduct polls if necessary, to gather more feedback from our constituents. Each of us is a representative of a single member constituent, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that it is incumbent upon us to listen to our constituents, to follow their wishes. It is also part of our responsibilities to make sure we understand what the wishes of our constituents are. So it is our individual responsibility to go out and canvass and talk to our constituents to ensure that they support what it is we're doing. But I also have a firm belief, Mr. Speaker, that our constituents, and this has been said to me by constituents, expect us to also lead and to make decisions on their behalf, especially when it comes down to a situation like this where we don't have a lot of time. There are opportunities there that can benefit all of us, and there are opportunities there that we need to capitalize on immediately. My constituents expect me, Mr. Speaker, to make a decision on their behalf, and that is what I intend to do here today. So, Mr. Speaker, I have satisfied myself that the controversial issues have been resolved. I think the Leader of the Opposition did a good job in explaining that. And what we're being presented with here today is a choice, an opportunity to reconcile putting these changes in place versus taking the easy road and just saying, no, I'm not doing anything till we do a referendum. I think moments like this, like these, Mr. Speaker, define leadership and define leaders. And our people have to now trust that they voted for leaders who are going to make the right decisions on their behalf. And that we are going to make informed, intelligent, and smart decisions based on what we have been presented with. Mr. Speaker, I was proud and honored to have been, as I said, I've been asked to accompany the team to London. And I played a supporting role to the then Leader of the Opposition, the member from Northside. And I fully support his efforts and what he did when we went to London together. He worked along with the Honorable Premier and his team. And I think that that made a huge difference in the outcome. Because when the team from Cayman arrived and you have the leader of the country accompanied by the Leader of the Opposition, it's not many instances where you would see that happen. And I think it sent a strong message. I was at a dinner in London and I had the opportunity to speak to two sitting ministers. I won't say which governments, but both of them told me they would have never taken that chance. They would have never invited the Leader of the Opposition along on a negotiation like that. So, the Premier and I, Mr. Speaker, may not be twins when it comes to our political philosophies. And it is no secret we often disagree on the different ways to govern this country, or how we would individually govern the country. But I would never accuse him, Mr. Speaker, of deliberately trying to harm this country. And that is the difference. Mr. Speaker, I have to give credit to the Premier. because he took a risky path. One that could have resulted in disaster, but I think he has been around this political world long enough to know that the path he was taking and the approach he was taking would result in what we are faced with here today, which is a unified effort to protect this country and to do what is best for this country. And so there may have been moments when even he may have questioned his decisions, but clearly that political wisdom has shown through. And I have to give him all respect for doing that. He could have easily done this or tried to do this in a more underhanded way, and I think that would have resulted in disaster. So while we got off to a rocky start, Mr. Speaker, I think that wisdom now shines through. And I want to also say that not just the elected members of the negotiating team, but the civil servants who accompanied us all played a very important role in negotiating. The Honorable Attorney General, his staff, Cabinet Office, all of those members played crucial roles in getting us to where we are today. And I think everybody has to be commended. And I really don't think that there were any personal agendas at play. I think everybody went there, Mr. Speaker, with the intention of representing this country and doing what is best for this country. So, Mr. Speaker, where does that leave us then? If we don't make these changes today, and I want the country to understand this, because I think everybody can tell that I'm a bit torn, because it ordinarily isn't the way I approach things. But if we leave things as is, you have to ask yourself, what is next? What's the next issue and the next crisis that's going to be pushed on us? Will it be gay marriage? Will it be the right for certain people to vote here who are not Caymanians? Will it be income tax? These are all questions we have to now ask ourselves. If we don't move our Constitution forward, if we don't put the decision-making and the control of what happens here firmly in the hands of our elected representatives who represent the wishes of the people of the Cayman Islands, if we don't do that here today, and for those on the outside who think that this is a power move, that this is being done for selfish reasons, think about what I just said. I have a responsibility to the people who I represent and serve and the future generations of this country. Mr. Speaker, I am willing to put my political credibility on the line here today, that this is the best thing for us. I'm not saying that I am any more embedded in this than any other member in this honorable House, but I do feel that we walked away from those talks with the best deal on the table. I don't think we could have done any better. So those who still have doubts, Mr. Speaker, those who are not convinced, I'm happy to talk to them. I'm happy to talk to anyone about my experiences. I've stayed quiet until today. I haven't said very much publicly. There have been some controversies, there's been some turmoil politically, but at the end of the day, I stayed quiet because I knew that I would get up one day and say what I'm saying here today. These changes, Mr. Speaker, are all good. They are not infringing on the rights of any one Caymanian, any single Caymanian. These are enhancing the rights of Caymanians and enhancing the representation we can give them. And that can only be seen as a positive. So I hope that the fact that members, Mr. Speaker, of the opposition can get up and support what is being done through this government motion sends a loud signal to the rest of the country that they need not worry. Their wishes have been well represented. Their rights have been well protected. And while today is one of those days that we work together for the best interests of this country, and tomorrow may be one of those days that we don't. For today, Mr. Speaker, this is the best thing to do for the Cayman Islands. And I am proud to be part of it, extremely proud. And it is, I would say, the highlight of my political career so far. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The